Hi and welcome to my channel. I'm Simon and today I am back with my January reading wrap-up. So the 11 books that I read in January, which is apparently 2,663 pages. So there we go. I'm not going to drown my wrap-ups in stats. It's something I'm going to kind of keep an eye on for myself over the year, but I don't know, we'll see. But what I do want to do at the end of these videos is, after I've talked about the books that I've read, I would really like to talk about how that reading month has left me feeling. I mean, I'll be honest, there's one word for it at the moment, and that is giddy. I'm feeling quite giddy about reading and about 2023 as a reading year because it has been a corking start. But yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about that and sort of what genres or directions or anything like that I'm sort of thinking about, because this year is very much about whim reading for me. I mean, obviously I will be reading books for work and stuff, but overall whim reading. Let's see where the previous month's whim make me feel like the next month's whims might head, or something. We'll see. I haven't recorded it yet, so I don't know how it's going to go. We'll find out in due course. On to the books. So as I said, I read 11 books. They were all corkers. I didn't read a single dud in January. I maybe liked some books less than others, but that's always the case. I was actually quite proud of myself because it was getting towards the end of the month and I'd read 11 books and I really wanted to squeeze in a 12th. And I thought, why? It's not a race. Reading is not a race. Just chill out. I guess it's probably because 12 is a nice round number. It's also one of my favourite numbers. Half of my other favourite number, 24. Random facts. It has been a corking start to the year, and it started with an absolute corker, and that is The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. Probably not been called a corker before. I don't think that's probably the most literary term for it. I thought this was phenomenal. I will say there's some very hard subject matter in this book, and it feels quite odd to kind of say that a book is, for this was, a 5-star read for me when it's got that in. However, the way in which it's written about, I think, is so important, and also the fact that these things happen. I think fiction can be unflinching, and so that's kind of another reason that I think it is such an incredible book. What's it about though? Well, I feel like it's a book that's probably been talked about quite a lot because it's Toni Morrison. It's about it really centres quite literally around a young girl called Pecola, who, as the book opens, we learn has, she's pregnant by her father. And that's not giving too much away because you hear that from two sisters at the start of the book. Now, Bagoo is at the very centre of the book because of this story. However, it kind of goes around her and we head to various different characters. So, like I mentioned, these two sisters who go to the same school as her, who at one point are a friend, then they see her being bullied. You kind of get different perceptions of Bagoo. You don't really go into her head too much. And I think if you did, it would be just too much, because she's a young girl who believes she's deeply both physically and just, in every way ugly, because she's told that all the time. It's making me feel slightly emotional talking about it, but I will try and rein it in. If you were in that, like I said, the whole time, it would just be too much bear. So what Toni Morrison does so cleverly is, like I said, she goes into different characters who give you these different perceptions on her, and some of them are not very kind, some of them are incredibly warm, like the whores who live nearby, and I love those characters. There's some brilliant set pieces where different characters spend time with each other. So there's one time where these two sisters that I mentioned are asked to leave the house because their lodger says, oh, go and get some ice cream, but they go back early because they just get some crisps or chocolate instead, and they see that he's basically hosting these whores in their house. And you have all these other set pieces around it, but the heart of and the centre of the book is definitely Pecola. And we even go into, which I thought at first I was like, oh no, but I actually think what Toni Morrison does is really, I don't want to say clever, but just insightful, and it's a very human, is that right? Basically, we even go into Cholly, Pecola's dad's mindset, and why he ends up doing what he does, and what's happened to him previously, his marriage, what he's been like with his wife, what her situation is like, and why she's the way she is. And she never forgives her characters what they do. That would not be right. But what she does do is look at how they've ended up in that situation, and I think that's a very deft thing to do. Sorry, slight change of angle because I had to go onto airplane mode as I was getting loads of text messages, and also a child was having a tantrum out on the road. Anyway, I think what she does is incredibly deft. I thought the writing was haunting and heartbreaking and beautifully brutal, which I really admire. And I felt like I had got to know, I don't know quite how it is because you don't get to meet every single person living there, but I did feel like I got to know like a whole town in 1940s Ohio. So yeah, I just thought it was phenomenal. I'm gonna head to Sula next month in March and sort of slowly pace myself because I don't want to inhale them all and then have no more to go. Although I could reread them, I suppose, but I'm not a big rereader. But I really, really want to read all of her work in order. I read Home a good few years ago, but it was, I think, when I wasn't at the right time in my reading life for it, which I think happens. Anyway, I thought this was phenomenal. Amazing way to start the year and hopefully a good sign of things to come. Then I read Content Warning Everything by Akwaeke Emeze, who is one of my favourite authors. I've absolutely loved their fiction for adults, their memoir in letters, and also their young adult writing, and this is their first poetry collection. And in here there's lots of themes of water, there's lots of things around Nigerian culture and spirits and whether we can separate our body from our spirit, and a lot of stuff around bodies as well. There's also a lot in here about found family, but in a really interesting way. It's about found family with Jesus, Mary, Mary Magdalene, sorry. And yeah, I just thought this was really interesting. It's not my favourite thing of theirs, but like, I'm not very good with poetry. So poetry, like, I just feel like I'm not clever enough for poetry, really. But I got this, not all of it, but I did definitely get it. And I just thought the heart of it is very much the themes of quite a lot of their other work. And Akwaeke just has this incredible way of expressing themselves. So yeah, I thought that was great too. Then a short story collection. Now, in my previous video, which was a reading vlog, I said I hadn't read any short stories because I then picked up a short story collection. I had. I don't know how I'd forgotten this was short stories. I really, really enjoyed it. It's Hold Your Fire by Chloe Wilson. And this is a book that I got from Australia after I heard Jacqueline at 6 Minutes for Me raving about it a couple of years ago, and I've been waiting for the right time, and then I randomly picked it up and I read the first story, which is literally 2 pages, and I was like, oh my goodness, I need to read everything in this book. Like literally it is that page and that, and it's about a child whose next door neighbour, they live in a big block of high-rise block of flats, gets a leopard. And it's it's what happens with that leopard and how the child next door gets involved. It's brilliant. It's twisty, even within that amount of slight amount of pages. And there's a sense of humour to it. There's a gothicness to it as well. And that definitely runs through the whole collection. There are some stories in here that I vividly remember. One is where a couple are going house hunting and one of them realises that she taught the estate agent, but then something really awkward happens in one of the houses they go to. I thought that was brilliant. You never quite knew where it was going to head next. There's one about 2 sisters, I think it's called Harbour, and it's about 2 sisters who go on this sort of retreat at Harbour and to sort of purify themselves, and it goes so dark. I wasn't expecting that. This does revel in darkness. It revels in bodily functions. It revels in quite extreme circumstances often, but I thought that was all really, really brilliant. And what I loved as well is there are certain themes that keep cropping up in different stories, even though the stories don't interlink. So for example, you have someone who's stealing blood from the blood donor where they work to feed their plant, and then there's another story about blood in a different way, and these themes kind of crop up. What I also quite enjoyed is there's no really likable characters in here. They're all doing quite devilish things, some extremely so and others less so, or people around them are, and I was just hooked by it. I thought from the first story it was going to be kind of Caris Davies. It's not quite, but I'm definitely really excited because Caris Davies for me is like short story icon. This to me was a really self-assured, funny, darkly funny, sometimes shocking but not in a voyeuristic way, just like a ooh and slightly titillating way in some ways actually. There's quite a lot of shenanigans that go on here. I'm going to be talking about shenanigans quite a lot in this video probably. I think Chloe Wilson is one to watch and I really, really enjoyed this. I also think the cover is absolutely brilliant. So we have that. Then an utterly bonkers book, which glows in the dark, I discovered, and that is Sayaka Murata's Earthlings. And this, I should say, is translated by Ginny Tapley Takamori from Japanese. I had read Convenience Store Woman and enjoyed it and had been meaning to read this for ages. And one thing that I'm trying to do a lot more, like I said earlier this year, is go by whim and just see what tickles my fancy. And it was January in Japan, and this tickled my fancy for that. I'd heard the ending was utterly bonkers. I won't spoil it, don't worry, but it is utterly bonkers. It goes in a whole direction that you just don't expect. But this is about two cousins, I want to get the name right, Natsuki and Yu. And Natsuki believes that she isn't human. She believes that she believes that she's got magic powers, and then her cousin believes he's an alien. And it's how these two have this kind of very special, also quite cloying and unsettling bond with each other. And due to the way their families behave about that, they kind of are pushed together and then also split apart. And they both believe basically they're not Earthlings, they're other. And we follow this relationship, and then as it goes on, something really awful happens to Natsuki, and it's how she deals with that trauma and how this adds to her belief that she is not a human and she's not part of a society that she just sees as basically like a baby making farm. As it goes on, and as decades sort of go on, it gets weirder and weirder, and there's a reunion of the two of them plus her husband that is just like, well, it's so bonkers. I thought this book dealt with, well, the way this book deals with trauma I thought was fascinating. I'm not sure how I feel about the ending still. I kind of thought it was brilliant because it was so utterly mad, but also I thought maybe because it went so far, it lost some of the impact by trying to be impactful in a different way. Does that make sense? I don't know. I just thought this was really interesting. I'm really looking forward to reading Life Ceremony, which is Murata's short story collection, so I will head to that at some point. Then on to a book that defies my usual rule that the last sentence, page, chapter, paragraph can't make a book. It has to be all the lead up to it. This sort of goes against that because, yes, there is a lot of lead up. Well, not really, because it's a novella in McClue by Tessa Moshereg, her debut. The final page literally hit me like an emotional juggernaut, and I was a bit of a wreck after reading it. And I won't say any more about why that might be, because I want those of you who've not read it to go and read it, because I think it is really, really good. I will say the lead up is a bit tricky, and I wasn't sure. I'm glad I stuck with it, and I think I did stick with it because it's so short. But basically it's about a man called McClue who is in prison because he may or may not have murdered a man who may or may not have been his best friend. And so as he's sort of becoming sober, we get these drunken, misty, hazy, foggy flashbacks of being in prison, of the lead up to that, of being stuck in the boat that he was on. He's kind of like a bit of a pirate, basically. And then also these flashbacks of some of the journeys that he went on this boat with Johnson, his best friend, who may or may not be dead, who he may or may not have killed. Sorry, who may or may not have been his best friend, who he may or may not have killed. We know he's dead. That's actually in some ways quite hard work, and I was a bit like, ugh, but some of the writing in it was absolutely brilliant, which is what kept me going. Also, it's quite vignette-y, quite short and sharp and punchy. But speaking of punches, it is just that final, I was like, oh my goodness, it literally knocked me for six. My jaw droppeth. I thought it was absolutely brilliant because of that final bit. So there we go. Now, something completely different, and I have to say, and I feel bad saying this because it's almost like I'm kicking the book, and I'm not. I'm kicking the publishing department of the book. This is The Other Half by Charlotte Vassell, and I read this for an event that I did with Charlotte at West Kirby Bookshop, which is a newish indie bookshop near me. And I probably might not have read the book if it hadn't been for the event because of the cover, which I think does it I think it does it a disservice. I was going to think, this doesn't do it any services whatsoever. I don't think this book does, let's try again. I don't think this cover does this book any favours because it looks to me a bit light and there's so much going on here. The book starts with the murder of a young woman, and we then go to a party that is being held by this incredibly posh man called Rupert for his 30th, where he's hired the top floor of a McDonald's and is having this champagne and cocaine filled party as Kentish Town McDonald's carries on the ground floor. And I have to say, for the first couple of chapters, I was like, I'm not sure how I'm going to fare with this. I don't think this is going to be a very me book. However, then it starts the next day and we meet Detective Beauchamp, and as soon as he arrives on the scene, I have like the biggest crush on him. Caius is like a dreamy man of dreams. He's so down to earth and so warm and so intuitive and insightful, and totally not like a lot of detectives you read about who generally have an alcohol problem or their marriage has failed, although he is in a failed relationship, which kind of becomes part of the book. What follows once he arrives on the scene, and it kind of gathers this pace and almost like this slight satirical edge, which I loved. Charlotte Vassell really balances some really serious subject matter with satire and comedy, and she just sort of, I felt like she was reveling in it, because actually this book is very much about class, it's about race, it's about consent, it's about art, it's about classics, it's about myths, it's about history. It's so much in here, and I just think it's brilliant. And I was so chuffed to hear that there is going to be a second in the series, because honestly, I just thought this was great. I haven't read very much crime over the last couple of years, and hopefully Pip and I are going to bring Crime Time back later in the year. For those of you who are new here, I used to do a series of videos with my best mate Pip, where we would read crime books together and then talk about them, plus other crime books that we'd read since we'd last seen each other. So I'm thrilled that there's going to be more of this, because I just really enjoyed it. It is a little bit, I don't know, it's also got nods to Agatha Christie in some ways. It's really hard to describe, but yeah, I would really recommend that one. As I would say this is a 5-star book for me. Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Now, I got into Taylor's writing last year when I read Carrie Soto Is Back for an event that I hosted with her in Liverpool, and I really enjoyed Carrie Soto Is Back. I read it in like pretty much a day, and considering it's about tennis and tennis tournaments, I wouldn't have thought I would have been gripped by it. I also quite often say I don't like books about art or music. This is very much about music. I feel like I'm preaching to the converted, because most people, or a lot of people who are watching this, will have read Daisy Jones and the Six, and it's becoming a show very soon. They've started to drop the singles off it, and I'm loving that already. Anyway, what's it about? So for those of you who haven't read it yet, it is about a band called The Six who are doing pretty well, and a young woman called Daisy who wants to make it in the music industry, and it's how after a duet that they do together, they then go on to create this album that becomes iconic, but it also becomes iconic because of the demise of the band. I don't feel like I've given anything away there. And what we have is told pretty much through like interviews. We have the different characters letting us know what happened. And at first I was like, this is not going to work for me. Well, Taylor Jenkins Reid is a genius, because it works absolutely brinking. Absolutely, that's a whole new word because of how I feel about this book. I just think it is really clever. It's blinking brilliant in the fact that characters, I didn't think I would get to know all the different characters. I totally did, because you see them through all different perspectives, and they'll be like, one of them will say something and someone will refute it, or someone will say, well, no, that didn't happen. That other person said that, and then this happened. And through all of that, you just build up this real, like, vivid impression of this cast of characters, and I just thought it was ace, and I literally devoured it. And I should say, it was my colleague Tess who got me onto this, because we were seeing each other and she said she was reading it and she was addicted, and I'd sent her a signed copy of Malibu Rising and she'd really loved that. And we've just become two absolute Taylor Jenkins Reid fanboys and girls. And yeah, I just thought, honestly, this was great. I felt like it was all real, like it had really happened, and I'm really intrigued to see the show. So yeah, very chuffed to have read that. 4 more to go. I thought this was going to be a short video, but apparently not. On to something salacious that surprised me with how salacious it was, but I thought was absolutely fantastic and has reignited, along with another book that I'm going to talk about at the very end, a sort of fire in me to read more queer fiction. Now, I read a lot of it when I was in my early teens, and then I didn't read between the ages of 16 and sort of 23, 24, and then I went back to it as like a way in. And then I will say over the last few years, maybe in the last decade, I just haven't got to it as much. Like I'll read a bit here and there, but I'm not like desperate to read it. And I think what I've worked out now is I want to read historical, if it's sort of UK based, I want it to be historical pre the AIDS epidemic. And what I also really want to read is stories of people who are queer all around the world except for here. I just don't want to really hear about any more contemporary white male queer stories. That's just my preference at the moment. Anyway, this is set in the UK. It's The New Life by Tom Crewe. So many people recommended this to me. This I picked for the Savage prompt, which are prompts that me and my mum are doing all year. We've got 13 of them, 1 per month and a bonus. This was, the prompt was that you needed to pick up a book that was blurbed or had a quote on by one of your favourite authors, and Kate Atkinson is one of my favourite authors, and so I picked this up. And this is set in the 1800s, in the lead up to Oscar Wilde being arrested, where we follow 2 men. We meet John, who is married to Catherine, although as we discover, he is a closeted homosexual. Obviously, homosexuality wasn't okay at the time because, you know, everything that happened with the Oscar Wilde case, which kind of comes to the fore later on. Yet it's really more about everything around that and how it affected other people rather than actually him. Oh, the sun's gone wild at the mention of Oscar Wilde. It starts off with a scene that is so sexy, I could not believe it. Like proper, that is the technical term, a literary term as well, I'm sure. It's so sexy. It's on this underground train in Victorian London, and I won't forget that. But then we follow him when he's watching men bathe at the river, and the way Tom Crewe writes about Jonathan's, I always feel like I have to call him Jonathan. I feel like John is over familiar, which is hilarious because he's John throughout the whole book. But that's kind of the character that he is, and it shows how Tom Crewe created such a vivid character. The way that Tom Crewe writes about desire and just, it's so vivid and so brilliant, and really took me back to when I was sort of questioning my sexuality and did I fancy men and all that kind of stuff. But he just writes about the allure of it so well. We also meet Henry, who is also in a marriage that's quite different in the fact that he's married a woman called Edith, and Edith is queer. He doesn't know that straight away, but he slowly comes to discover it when she meets a woman, when she introduces him to a woman called Angelica. This all happens very early on, so I haven't spoiled anything. And then we follow these 2 marriages, but also as Henry and John start writing to each other because they want to write a book about inversion, which is what they used to call homosexuality then. And then obviously the Oscar Wilde case changes everything. I thought this was absolutely brilliant. I will say sometimes it was a little academic because John and Henry are such academics. That kind of happened. I loved Frank, who we meet and becomes John's lover after one of the days by the river watching men bathe. One thing that I loved in this book that I really, really, if any of you have read a book that is fiction about queer rural historical life, there is one section here about 2 men in Derbyshire who John and Frank go to visit. And it's some of the best, most hopeful, joyful writing I have read in such a long time. And I wanted a whole book about them. Now, I have read On the Red Hill by Mike Parker. That's post-Victorian era, but also non-fiction. But that does do exactly that. But I kind of want, maybe I need to ask Mike if he's got any recommendations. Anyway, suffice to say, I just thought this was really, really great. Yes, occasionally the academic stuff got over. I was a bit unsure about how John's character developed a little bit as well, if I'm honest. He did some stuff towards the end I wasn't too sure about, which if you've read it, I'm happy to have a chat about. But yeah, I thought this was a great debut novel, and just a great novel actually. You shouldn't need to have debut in front of that. It was just brilliant. Then on to my penultimate bit of fiction, but I've still got a couple more books to go after this. And that is The Beginner's Goodbye by Anne Tyler. Now, out of all the books that I read this month, I enjoyed this very much, but it's probably the one that let me down. And this is why, because a lot of you will say in the comments when I do a haul, like, why don't you read blurbs? Like, what's the issue there? Sometimes blurbs lie. And I felt like this blurb did fib a bit, and I didn't get what I was sold. So the premise of this on the blurb is that a man has been widowed after his wife Dorothy is killed in an accident where she's reaching for some elusive biscuits, and there's something to do with an oak tree, but then her ghost comes back and they start to almost kind of get into the habit of their marriage all over again. Now, when you start reading it, Aaron is walking around with Dorothy and people can actually see her ghost, which is quite an interesting it's an interesting situation. I was really keen for that. And then suddenly it goes back to her death, and then her ghost doesn't appear for literally another like third of the book. And when it does, I don't know, I felt this book needed to be a lot longer, and actually for that to be something that kind of came more to fruition, because suddenly it sort of whizzes to what happens in the future with Aaron. I also really struggled to place what time this was set in, because it felt very sort of 1920s, 1930s, partly because Aaron is only in his late 30s, about to be 40, I think. No, late 30s, and Dorothy was in her mid 40s, but they come across like 66-year-olds. Like, I don't know, that I found that a bit odd. But then suddenly they'll be in an Apple shop. So it was an interesting book to go back to Anne Tyler with, and I will definitely read more. But the whole way through, I kept thinking about Elizabeth Strout and how I feel like Strout does this sort of thing better. I mean, it's not the same. I just felt like, oh, Strout's got the edge on this sort of book for me. And yeah, that's that, really. So I enjoyed it, but it wasn't my favourite. And it's not, is it my favourite Anne Tyler? No, I don't think it is. But then I think Anne Tyler's been a bit, looking back on it, a bit like that for me, where I've liked it, but I've not loved it. So, but I'll still try a few. A lot of you have recommended that I should head to sort of more of her fiction from the 80s. So I will. The penultimate book, though, that I read was A History of My Brief Body by Billy Ray Belcourt. I talked about this in a vlog recently, actually, along with The New Life. And I think actually I've vlogged all of the books that I've read this year, apart from Charlotte Bassel, because if I'm reading a book for work, I don't want to film my thoughts about it as I go, because I don't know where it's going to go, and if it's a workbook, that seems a bit weird. Anyway, moving on. This is Billy Ray Belcourt's essay collection. He's a poet, and he's got a novel that came out last year that I may or may not have read in February. You'll have to wait until the next wrap up. I'm not doing that many reading vlogs throughout this month, although there will be a vlog every Sunday. Moving on. I picked this up mainly because of Benjamin Green over at Benjamin's Journal, his channel linked down below, who raved about it. And I do agree, this is a really, really, really excellent essay collection. It looks at what it's like to be NDN and queer in Canada, and there's some really interesting insights to that. It gave me an insight into Canada I hadn't seen. I kind of want to find out much more, and so that was really, really interesting. It's also big brain energy, and it's, how can I put it? It reminded me of Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts, and how I felt reading that book, where I felt like she took the top of my head off, poured loads of ideas in, popped the top of my head back on, shook it, and said, go away and have a think about that and come back later. And that's what I feel like I need to do with that book, because I've never gone back to The Argonauts, and I've always said that I will, and I feel like I need to do that with this. The only thing I will say is the difference from what I remember of The Argonauts is that I do feel like certain subjects are repeated and actually could have been combined into one essay rather than maybe two or three, because when there were subjects that hadn't come up before, they felt really vivid and different and really stood out. So that's just one element. But I thought the writing was incredible. I also, and this is going to be the case with any essay collection that has a literary sort of twist, I hadn't read all of the authors that Billy Ray Belcourt is talking about. So when he talks about Maggie Nelson, I totally got it. When he was talking about Han Kang, I got it. When he was talking about Ocean Vuong, I got it. But then with Sheila Heti, etc., I wasn't so sure. And again, that was slightly alienating. Not the fault of the book. It's not Billy Ray's fault that I've not read those authors, but it's just something that I think was part of the reaction that I had to it. So there we go. But it sent me off to more of his work and has made me think again, I want to find out more about what it's like to be queer in other places, because as I said with this, it's what it's like to be queer, NDN, and be both those things in Canada, which from the outside for me always seems like a haven. And he doesn't paint this out to be it doesn't paint it out to be a horrible country at all, but he points out the issues that it's got, which I think is really important and vital. And yeah, now this final book I think is going to be one that just grows and grows and grows on me the more space I have from it. I actually started it last year and read the first 2 stories, one of which really stood out to me and the other one I wasn't so sure about, but then I got busy and my brain got busy with all sorts of stuff and burnout and whatever. And so I'm about like, oh, what short story collection would I like to head to next? And I picked up The Dreaming by Andre Bagoo, and oh my goodness, I loved this collection. I will say there are a couple that have faded for me, but that's always going to happen in any collection, I think. It's really hard, apart from The Redemption of Galen Pike by the aforementioned Karis Davis, which I think is a perfect short story collection. It's really hard for everyone to be a crowd pleaser because they're all about different things. These, on the whole, look at what it's like to be queer in the Caribbean, and very much like, well, not very much like because they're a bit different, but it also looks at what I was saying about with Tom Crewe's book, the allure of the unknown or the unattainable or the salacious or the love that dare not speak its name. But also it looks at the, what is the term? I feel like it begins with V. But it looks at desire, like, and the absolute desire you can have, and how you have to keep that secret, how it can be dangerous, how it can be so thrilling, how it can be so sexy. And this is very much like The New Life, got some incredible sex scenes in a good way. Like, we've got big brain energy, we've also got big dick energy in these books, I won't lie. And in fact, that's one particular subject in one of these short stories. I loved that. I loved the honesty, the salaciousness, the celebration of it, as well as the darkness, the danger, all those things. And it is, in some parts, these stories are heartbreaking. There's one, I think it's called 1960, that literally almost had me weeping. Yeah, 1960, that had me weeping. The Forest Ranger had me weeping. Conundrum had me weeping. But then also some of them had me laughing. Like Hunger is so interesting about gay apps. And actually one thing that I have noticed is, because that actually comes up a bit in this book, is I'm really enjoying some writing on social media and apps and tech and how they've become part of society, that's done from a slightly wry but also, I don't know, naughty, honest, very, very open and frank angle. I just think it's great. I'm a Fan by Sheena Patel was one of those books last year that I just loved, about what it's like to be a woman of colour in the UK with all of those things going on Instagram, blah, blah, blah. And these look more at queer apps, I guess. Not that I'm saying that Instagram isn't queer. It's got a lot of queer people. I'm on there. It's linked down below. Anyway, I just thought this was phenomenal. It had a real fire to it. I just loved it. And very much like Billy Ray Belcourt, I've gone on and read more of Andre Bagoo this month. So, and I don't do that often. And that's why I think I'm just so excited about reading this year, because I've kind of thrown all of my old ways out the window, and I'm just sort of, or out the library, whatever, and I'm just sort of really loving seeing where I'm going. It has reminded me, so just to go over it all, I should say, like, again, absolute banger. So, as I said, I was going to do a sort of wrap up on how my reading went. It was a corking reading month. I hope you can tell that I just really enjoyed everything I read in January. It was just a real treat. It has reminded me I need to read more non-fiction. I didn't read as much translated fiction as I would have liked, but at the same time, I have now been sort of going through my shelves and finding some of the queer stories from other countries that I haven't read yet, and I'm getting ready to kind of have a bit of a binge read of those, so I'm really, really looking forward to that. Yeah, it's reignited a fire for queer literature that I think had been dormant for quite a while, because either I'd overread about it or I was reading the same thing, or I wasn't kind of trying out different stuff. So more on me than the books, definitely. What a corking reading month. So that's my wrap up, really. I'm a bit giddy about it all. I'm very excited for the rest of the reading in 2023. I can't wait to see what's going to come next. February, I've got a bonkers project on, which you'll find out about at the end of February. What a teaser. Is that too much of a tease? I don't know. Let me know in the comments down below. But I would love to know in the comments down below what your favourite books of January were, how your reading month was, and if you have read any of these or if you're now planning on reading any of them, because of my thoughts on them. It has been a treat chatting to you all. Thank you for watching, and I should say, if you like this, like it. If you want to subscribe, do. And also, as always, my Instagram, my Patreon, all those other things and other places that you can find me if you want to stalk us are linked down below, and I will see you in another video very, very soon. Bye.